Hey, everybody, please remember to subscribe, like, and share. Thank you very, very much.
All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome back in. I got Mr. Stevens back in for another chat. We've had him on a couple of times in that, and he's going to educate us on something that we're really, well, Americans especially don't really get taught much about, other than we just know we whooped you British twice, so something.
Your
That's
candor is admirable, if somewhat eccentric.
what do you say? Well, we tend to like our men mad and a little bit religious. That's why the women fall in love with preachers.
That's it.
Something along those lines. And it really, in school, it's touched on a little bit. Teachers really don't tell us much, other than we come out with the idea that we won the war. So, what exactly is it? What caused this war? I mean, first of all, did Britain did they plan on retaking the provinces?
Not really. It's kind of tricky. So, there's a lot of debate about it in Parliament. So, the war is for Britain. You have to remember the entire War of 1812 is combined, maybe a smaller Napoleonic battle, right?
Mm-hmm. You get wars taking place all over the world over this too. This is almost like a world war.
Yeah, they're fighting the Napoleonic Wars, which are it's the largest war they'll fight until 1914. So, there's not a lot of attention. They sent about 5,000 regulars, and they're like, all right, get it done. This is very peripheral. So for the majority of the war, the goal for the British is to just not lose Canada. That's it, right? Now, when it briefly appears that the British have won the Napoleonic Wars, because I don't know if you're familiar with the Napoleonic Wars, but in 1814, the Battle of Paris, Napoleon abdicates. He's sent to Elba, and for a nice couple of months, they think it's over, and then Napoleon decides to bring 1,000 of his closest friends back to France and takes over all of France with a regiment. It's one hell of a story. But basically, in that interlude, Britain sees an opportunity to really unleash the power of the empire on America. Now, you didn't learn this in school because this is not what they teach you, but America, by the end of the War of 1812, was on its knees. It was quickly becoming bankrupt. Its armies were collapsing. The British were on the offensive. There have been very few times in American history where the Union was so perilously close to destruction. It really only in the 19th century is rivaled by the Civil War. And that's because America had really fought an incredibly incompetent war, to be blunt. So there's this brief period where there is serious consideration towards driving the war further. Now, I'm not aware of anyone except the most fire-breathing anti-Republicans in the Parliament actually arguing for the reconquest of Britain. However, in order to secure the British-Canadian First Nations alliance, the Indigenous, they had formed a confederacy under Tecumseh. The agreement was that the Confederacy, this is the Indigenous Confederacy, not the Southern Confederacy that would exist 50 years later, that the Indigenous Confederacy should receive their own country, which would basically be Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, and part of Ohio. That none of this territory was controlled by the U.S. The U.S. claimed it, but the actual ownership of that territory was in dispute. And I would argue that's what the war is really about. When this was presented, the Treaty of Ghent, as a condition of peace, the Americans made it clear that they would fight to the last man and the last drop of treasure before they saw the Indigenous have their own country. I'll let you draw the conclusions you will about the Americans based on that. So the British considered pursuing the war further. Arthur Wellesley, in his glory, having defeated Napoleon's armies everywhere he'd fought them, and about to defeat them at Waterloo, that wouldn't happen yet. He made the case as one of Britain's premier generals that a war in the Canadas and the United States, due to its lack of infrastructure and due to the limited size of the armies, would be a protracted war that'd be fought for decades, and it was pointless to continue. And so, because of his advocacy, the British decided to acquiesce to a status quo antebellum. Now, as this was happening, this was agreed on December 24th. with John Quincy Adams, no less, as one of the signatures at Ghent. By the time this reached the United States for ratification, the British had already begun operations in Louisiana, resulting in the famous Battle of New Orleans, which was fought a few days before the treaty reached the United States. Now, as it happens, the Battle of New Orleans is the most one-sided victory for either side in the war, obviously for the Americans. And because of the timing of this, followed by the ratification of the treaty, this has led to the rather amusing myth that the Battle of New Orleans won the War of 1812. Quite the opposite. The Battle of New Orleans was an idiotic mistake by the British, and was completely unnecessary, as the British were completely ready to ratify the treaty, and so were the Americans. Had the British somehow won the Battle of New Orleans, it is possible the British might not have ratified it without further concessions. But that's the only outcome that would have changed. The war was going to end. It just was going to come down to how much America was going to have to give up. With the victory at New Orleans, America didn't give up anything. Britain didn't give up anything. The Indigenous Confederacy was forced to give up literally everything. And in that respect, the War of 1812 is essentially the the Indigenous War of Independence. And what's unbelievably cruel is they were, without question, some of the best fighters in that war. They rarely lost a battle. Without their support, Canada would have been conquered, I think, in 1813. But despite this, at the moment of decision, the British abandoned them and the Americans made their destruction really the only condition of peace. And it's frankly it's frankly atrocious, and it's a black stain on both of our countries. But that is the cruelty of the war. Beyond that, its impact on Canada and America are pretty negligible. America would soon forget about the war. The biggest accomplishments of America diplomatically were the not overturning, but the ignorance of the Continuing Seas Act. But the British had already agreed not to enforce that before the war began. So what America accomplishes essentially in this war is that the British removed their garrisons from the Ohio Territory. They stopped trading weapons with the Indigenous, and the Americans therefore can continue to move into the West, opening more land for slavery and setting themselves up for a civil war. For the British, they could say the Americans failed to dictate their policies in the high seas, and they could maintain the Continuing Seas Act, and in principle, maintain the Impressment Act, even though they never enforced it again. So both sides basically proved that they had very large palaces. It was frankly a very dumb war, and its outcomes were quite limited. The only people to whom it had a profound effect were the Indigenous, and unfortunately, in that respect, it was another contributor to the genocide of the Indigenous in both of our countries. So it's a very depressing ending.
I mean, because if somebody asked me what the War of 1812 was over,
it's a good question.
I was asked, I don't know. And
that's why things.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah, I kind of.
I know we invaded the battle on the lakes, and the White House got burned. So,
God. Well, I've kind of already gestured at it. Basically, the War of 1812, you have to understand the condition of this. First off, we understand it. You have to remember that America declared the war. So if you want to know who's causing it, usually the country declaring the war has something to do with that. So we have to look at why America chose to declare the war. And America had some grievances, some probably more legitimate than others, at least in a modern ethical sense. So the context of this war is America was caught between Francophobia and Anglophobia. The Federalist Party was Anglophilic. They loved the British and they hated the French. And the Anti-Federalist Party, now known as the Republican Democrat Party, were anti-British, pro-French. Now, the Republican Democrats became the National Republicans. Now, this is not the Republican Party that of 1860 or the Republican Party of today. This party would essentially reemerge as the Democratic Party. But at the time, they were calling themselves the Democratic Republicans, and within them, there was the National Republicans, which were the Young Americans. They were the new wave of politicians. And what they wanted was expansion into the West. They wanted to push the boundaries of Kentucky and the new state of Tennessee. And why they wanted to do this, frankly, was the expansion of slavery, as well as the expansion of rural farming.
About the war, because I've seen the invasion routes. I mean, is that where the British put boots on the ground from Montreal, I believe?
Yeah. Well, Montreal was also a key position of fighting, but Basically, the young Republicans want a war with the Brits. The Federalists, like the Brits, they want the war to be against France in order to suppress these godforsaken Democrats. America's already too democratic as it is. Their Federalists feel, and good Lord, the French are taking it way too far. Idiotically. They felt that way, to be frank. So what happens at that stage is you get the British, they begin to flex their muscles on the diplomatic stage. So at this point, the Americans, as a neutral country, have been trading with the French and the British. The British decide that the Americans can't do that. Since they are enemies against the French, they declare that any importation to France must stop in Britain first, and the British will have the right to check the cargo, confiscate anything. Are you okay?
Yes, I thought I was tapping off a text, and I had the volume up on my key thing. I was like, "What is that?" Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So the basically, the British say, look, you have to take your ships, dock them in our harbors. We get to check your cargo. If you have anything that we think is useful for the war effort, we just get to confiscate it at your cost. Also, for this wonderful service we're providing you, you're going to have to pay us a fee because, I mean, we're not stealing your stuff for free. And that's classic British. That's the Continuing Seas Act. They also decide, look, you can tell someone they're an American citizen, but if they're a British subject and they just moved to your country, they're still British because you might choose citizenship. You do not choose to be a subject. This issue is discussed wonderfully in Alan Taylor's The Civil War of 1812. Great book on the war. One of the better books. And it's interesting because American historiography on the War of 1812 is way behind Canadian. But Alan Taylor is one of the few American historians really saying interesting stuff about the War of 1812. Because the British wouldn't recognize the legitimacy of American citizenship diplomatically, and they didn't recognize the legitimacy of the American Merchant Marine, they were basically treating the Americans like a colony. You're still basically British, and we can go on your ship, and if we find anybody who is legally a British subject, who was not born in America, but born in Britain, or we think was born in Britain, we can just basically kidnap them and make the fight in the Napoleonic War. And over 100 Americans were kidnapped to fight in the Napoleonic Wars based on this. Furthermore, we get to seize your cargo. Now, what's interesting is this mostly affected New England states, but the New England states didn't favor war because despite these atrocities, or atrocity is a strong word, but they were certainly disgusting acts, the British were still an important trading partner, and the Federalist Party was very powerful in New England, and there was a lot of Francophobia and Anglophilia. A lot of them wanted to help the British and didn't think these were totally unreasonable demands. It's actually landlocked Kentucky and Tennessee that are pushing against these grievances. Why? Because they want an excuse to go to war with Britain. Why do they want to do that? Great question. Because in the Indian Territory, otherwise known as the Ohio Territory, this is future Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, the British have maintained military garrisons while they await the Americans to pay reparations for the revolution. They agreed to pay about $13 million or pound sterling at the time, which is significant. They hadn't finished paying it off yet. While they were garrisoned there, they were openly trading with the Pan-Indigenous Confederacy created by Tecumseh. Tecumseh created the Pan-Indigenous Confederacy to end the illegal sale of land from the indigenous to the Americans. The Americans would often find any indigenous chief they could and say, would you sell me this land? And then they would get them drunk or trick them or threaten them. I shouldn't say drunk or trick. That's condescending. It's really more of a case of like putting a gun to your head and saying, you have to freaking sign this. And then they would force these people to sell other people's land without their consent. And this also rested upon an erroneous understanding of indigenous politics. A chief doesn't have the right to sell land. But the Americans insisted they did. What they didn't have the right to do is say no. So Tecumseh formed the Confederacy so that all of the nations would promise to each other, we're not selling anything to the Americans anymore. And if they invade, we're going to fight back. Well, to fight back, they're going to need guns. And the British say, well, we want fur because that is one of the most valuable things we have left because we lost all the cotton provinces. And you want guns, and we'd like you to fight the Americans, so this could work out really nicely. So they start trading guns. They give them to Tecumseh's Confederacy, and the Confederacy gives them back furs. So the British are making money and fighting a proxy war against the Americans at the same time. Kind of like how America was arming Al-Qaeda and the Taliban to fight against the USSR in the Russo-Afghanistan war. So Now America's fighting a proxy war with the indigenous. They really want the British out of there so they can take over this territory, and the indigenous will lose their support. So really why they're pushing for this is because they can go to war with the Brits, get them out of Ohio, and then they can take over Ohio and hopefully bring some slavery there. And if that means pretending to care about the merchant marine in New England, so be it. So you get this ridiculous situation where the people most affected by the conditions Britain are forcing are the ones who don't want to go to war, and the ones unaffected by this umbrage are the ones that are pushing for war with nothing to do with the actual umbrage itself. That's insane, but that's the situation.
This is all kind of, it's
pretty mindful.
Yeah, it is.
There is a push. This is just my interpretation. People disagree with me, fair enough. I'm not the be all end all. This is my interpretation of it. There is a push for the annexation of Canada. There are certainly people who want to do that because they want to get the last vestiges of Britain out of North America. My opinion is I think the push is really for the West because, frankly, there's just not as much money to be made up north. It's harder to grow cash crops up here, and you can get just as many beavers as you can in Ohio as you can in Canada. So there's really no need to invade Canada, but there are certainly people who want to take it. But that's what the war boils down to. Now, the Brits, they go to the Americans and say, look, we're not going to revoke the Continuing Seas Act. We're not going to revoke the Impressment Act, but we really don't want to have to deal with this right now, so we will stop enforcing them if you guys calm down. But by the time that message arrives to America, James Madison, under extreme pressure from the National Republicans, many of which were still Federalists and threatening to split off, he finally says, okay, fine. So in the narrowest vote in American history for war, even more narrow than the vote for Iraq, America votes to declare war on Britain in 1812. So what it's really over is a bunch of laws that Britain promised to stop enforcing, and really it's over, in my opinion, the Ohio Territory. Now, for the indigenous, Tecumseh sees this as a golden opportunity because he proposes an alliance with Britain. In return, the indigenous will be given what's called the Indian Territory, this mash of territory in Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, Illinois. Not all of Ohio, by the way, just a slice of it. And this territory will serve as a buffer state between the Americans and the Brits. Tecumseh is trying to play the Brits and Americans against each other. He's a political genius, you see. Tecumseh is actually really, in a lot of ways, the Napoleon of North America. Just due to captures of control, he wasn't successful, but the same kind of brilliancy in military strategy and political strategy. And his plan is to play them against each other so that the British will agree to support an indigenous confederacy and the two will become allies to protect against the United States. Now, the U.S. could defeat the pan-indigenous confederacy. They could defeat the British in Canada. They cannot defeat both. So if you make two separate nations that are allied with each other, the Americans will be halted in their expansionism and the indigenous will have a chance to survive. So this is their war of independence. He proposed the idea to Brock, General Brock, who is the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada and our Premier General in Upper Canada, says that's freaking brilliant. I love it. And they form military alliance. And that goes really well for the first few months. The two of them orchestrate the Battle of Detroit, which is one of the most significant early victories over the Americans, a massive and humiliating triumph, which actually made the commanding general of Detroit, William Hull, more hated than Benedict Arnold for quite some time. Benedict Arnold wouldn't become popular again until the Civil War, rather infamously popular. Hull, for a long time, was considered even worse than Arnold.
Tell me a little bit about the Battle of Detroit. I mean, you can just brief synopsis. You ain't got to go into it. I've never heard of it.
General Hull commanded a invasion force. This is the first invasion force to attack Canada. They move through what is today Michigan into Amherstburg, Ontario. While they're at Amherstburg, they are attacked by Tecumseh's forces, their lines of communication. This terrifies Hull, who is already scared of the enemy. He retreats. He's informed by his commanders, sir, if you retreat back into Michigan, your militia will disband it. So he reluctantly makes a stand at Fort Detroit. Now, Fort Detroit is a critical position because it is one of four key positions, which are Montreal, Kingston, Queenston Heights, and Detroit, which are, Michilimackinac and Detroit, not Queenston Heights, which are critical to defending Upper Canada. It's Kingston, Queenston, I can't speak today. Kingston, Niagara, Michilimackinac, and Detroit. Now, Tecumseh and Brock had already taken Michilimackinac bloodlessly, also an interesting story. But Detroit was the first one that would require some action. After his supply lines were attacked, Hull was already terrified, and unfortunately for Hull, among the booty captured was his correspondence, where they learned as much, that he was totally petrified of the indigenous. So Hull decided to ease his nerves with a healthy little dose of opium, and he was high as hell. And this is when General Brock and Tecumseh arrive with their forces and array them for battle. Now, they're outnumbered 3-1 against a fortified position. Brock knows a direct assault is almost suicidal. Brock and Tecumseh are both exceptionally daring generals. They're not stupid. But Brock has an idea. He wants to fight them outside of their works. So he proposes that Hull surrenders. His thinking basically is either he will call the bluff, come out, and even though we're outnumbered, I think he's an idiot, and I suspect fighting defensively I can defeat him. Or, best case scenario, he doesn't call the bluff and I just win. And his bluff basically is, look, we outnumber you, which was a lie. We are going to storm your works. If you surrender now, I will take full responsibility for the actions of the indigenous under my command. If you do not surrender, then I cannot take responsibility for their actions. And this is playing upon the American racial fear of the indigenous, that they're all a bunch of savages, which was, of course, nonsense, but is something that a lot of Americans believed, including Hull. 2 of Hull's daughters were in Fort Detroit. And his first thought is, they're going to murder my kids. So, still high as high could be, Hull surrenders his vastly superior force, strongly fortified, to Brock and Tecumseh's vastly inferior force in open ground. Congress was not exactly pleased with this, and Hull was court-martialed and sentenced to be executed. The only reason he was shot was because of his rather impressive and substantial service in the Revolution. Hull was one of a number of generals who were called back into service for the War of 1812 and were frankly far past their time. And so he was spared, but he was dishonorably removed from the service and lived the rest of his life in shame. Congratulations, General Hull. Anyway, so as the war progresses, unfortunately, General Brock is killed, leading his troops in a frontal assault at the Battle of Queenston Heights against, incidentally, a young captain named Captain John E. Wool.
Wow.
General Wool, of course, would command the Harpers Ferry garrison in the Civil War. Now, you think that's interesting. When Wool decided to actually seize the Heights at Queenston that Brock had to retake, first he had to receive his orders from Stephen von Rensselaer, the nephew of Solomon von Rensselaer, the nephew of Commander Stephen von Rensselaer. He also had to pass by a particularly effective colonel who was demonstrating, despite his young age, his incredible ability to command troops. And that man's name was Colonel Winfield Scott,
I've heard of him.
who would fight his first battle against General Brock on Queenston Heights. Brock was killed after the Heights were taken. He attempted foolishly to retake them by a frontal assault, despite him basing his entire defenses on the presupposition that a frontal assault was suicidal, but that's Brock for you. He's shot in the heart, probably by a 50 caliber Kentucky, and so Tecumseh, tragically, this is a whole other story. Tecumseh would survive. Of course, he wasn't actually at the battle. John Norton was leading indigenous forces at the battle and basically staved off the British long enough for Roger Hill's sheep to arrive with reinforcements and to retake the Heights. Another battle, the Canadian British forces only won because of the indigenous that they would betray. Now, fast forward to 1813, Tecumseh is disgusted with the new British commander. I can't remember his name for now, for some reason. I'll remember it in a minute, I'm sure. He was a loser. Starts with a P, as I recall. Anyway, a Proctor. William Proctor, or Henry Proctor. Henry Proctor. I could care less. He doesn't deserve to be remembered that well. Proctor assumed command after Brock's death. Proctor was the opposite of Brock. He loved nothing more than a good retreat, and he planned to retreat all the way to Kingston. The problem is every single step away from the invading Americans is a step away from the land that the indigenous are trying to defend. And Tecumseh really didn't see how giving up all of Upper Canada would be particularly helpful for the defense of Upper Canada. So at a place called Chatham, at that time known as Moravian Town, Tecumseh insisted that they stand there holding firm, and that he and the British would mix their bones if they were not successful. Proctor promised to stand with him there. When they reached that position, Proctor promptly turned around and started retreating. Tecumseh was disgusted. The remaining British troops attempted with Tecumseh to execute a rather brilliant tactic where the American cavalry, led by William Henry Harrison, would attack the British center, and then the Indigenous would fall upon their flanks as they were disguised in the line of trees. Unfortunately, the British line broke almost instantly, and so it became a fight between the outnumbered Indigenous against Harrison. At this point, either John Tyler, William Henry Harrison, or more likely neither of them, killed Tecumseh. There's actually a story where legend has it that Tecumseh's voice could be heard calling on his men to keep fighting. His war whoop was legendary. It could be heard. It was a centurion call, and it could be heard and heard until suddenly, tragically, it was silenced. And when he died, really the last best hope for Indigenous sovereignty died too. It's tremendously heartbreaking and infuriating. But he was killed, and Harrison and Tyler would compete for credit for this murder for the rest of their miserable lives. Sorry, am I being too obvious? William Henry Harrison would die after a pathetic 40-day service as president, and John Tyler would become president by accident and do everything in his power to make sure that slavery succeeded in America.
Hey, you know, sorry, do you know he may have just died or may still be alive. He had a grandson.
Yeah. Now I should double check. I think that was John Tyler. I'm actually not sure. Let me just double check that. I might be thinking Tippecanoe and Tyler too. I think that was Tyler who was at the battle, because Harrison was. Let me just double check that, because I don't want someone to listen to this and be like, "You fool!" I might be mixing him up with someone else. Harrison was there. Well, but he was remembered for Tippecanoe, which is a whole other war crime that he and Harrison helped to commit. But anyway, both of them served to be miserable failure presidents. Neither of them combined even half the equal of the man they killed that day. Not that I want to get too passionate about it. So Tecumseh was dead, and the problem is with the loss of Tecumseh and Brock, there was really no one left to advocate for the promises made to the Indigenous. So at Ghent, the British have a very easy time abandoning the Indigenous. And the Indigenous themselves, after the Battle of Chippewa, largely stopped supporting the British, because at the Battle of Chippewa, this is very late in the war, the Haudenosaunee, which were the central keystone of the Confederacy, found themselves fighting other Haudenosaunee on the American side. And they basically, it's quite a beautiful moment. They realized, for the love of God, we were fighting this war for independence, and these two warring colonial countries have us fighting each other. This is not worth it. They literally dropped their guns half of the battle and just leave, because they realized this is idiotic. And at that point, that's demonstrative of how much the Confederacy was collapsing, that they were Indigenous fighting for the Americans. So it was over. When Tecumseh died, the unifying keystone was gone, and there was no one left to advocate for it. I actually argue it's the most significant death of the war. But as one less interesting connection, where this happens, Chatham, Kent, you might be interested to know that 45 years later, a fellow by the name of John Brown would arrive in Chatham, Kent to raise forces for his proposed revolution in the United States, and would write a new constitution for Virginia in Chatham, Kent. And the next year, he and some of the men that he raised in Chatham, Kent, along with many others he raised in the States, would attack Harper's Ferry. Same town, same place. A lot of history there, if you know where to look. There's a little War of 1812 for you. Hopefully, between the ending of the war and the causes and a few of those battles, it all starts to make sense. You have to rearrange a few of the puzzle pieces, but it's all there.
I mean, I've learned a lot of it. I mean, I forgot if you said in Preston. I remember that's how it's taught here, was over, in Preston. So I did not know anything about the Ohio and the Indigenous people or any of that. No, we've never taught that.
Yeah, and it's not in the official declaration of war either, but you have to put your thinking cap on and ask, why the heck is it a bunch of Kentuckians, Missourians, and like Virginians in the West that are advocating for this war when it's affecting New Englanders who are opposed to the war? Like, they're saying, we have to protect you from imprisonment. No, you don't. We're going to fight for you. We'd rather you not. That's where you have to make your inferences, right? It's an excuse. It's like, frankly, it's like the United States declaration of war in Iraq. In Iraq in 1812 have a lot of similarities. Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, but hey, that's an excuse to go to Iraq. So it's the same BS, different century.
Yeah, that I like when you said I was remember that Ron Paul he introduced a declaration of war and tried to bring it to a vote instead of just use of military conflict because he said that's illegal. He didn't have that. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
He was opposed to the Iraq War, the Patriot Act.
No. Was it? Well, I'm sure he would have voted against it, but Ron Paul said, "But if you want to go to war, we have to give you the authority to go to war."
Oh, okay. So he's opposed to Patriot Act. Well, that's the magic about Ron Paul. A broken clock is right twice a day. I would agree with him on that. The Patriot Act and the war on terror were absolutely illegal in principle. They give the U.S. president far too much leaping authority. And that's been abused by Trump. It's been abused by Obama. It was abused by Bush. Biden hasn't abused it yet, so congratulations for that. But Democrats and Republicans alike have abused it.
Anybody who's never listened to him or just heard little clips of him, no, talk about how much they hate Ron Paul and danger he is. I'm like, have you ever listened to the guy? I mean, if you've ever listened to him explain something, I was like,
I have. I think he was insane, but no, I've listened to him. I'll be honest, I wasn't impressed, but I don't want to get into that. I don't want to.
Oh, well, yeah, we forgot we was going to talk politics. I'm glad you stopped me there.
I'm good.
I'll start talking about Ron Paul and this right here. And then, oh God, yes, I know, because it's so just exhausting. I mean,
yeah, I rest assured, I've listened to him. I've given him his fair hearing.
Yeah, I'm sure. Sorry, I got caught on something else. Okay, so tell me, you said the British landed 5,000 troops. Well, when did they burn D.C.? Was that 1814?
Yeah, that was fun. Basically, and I'm glad you said the British, because there's this pervasive myth in Canada being the only part of the world that actually cares about this war, specifically Ontario, and most specifically Southern Ontario is the only part of this country that cares about the war. If we're really specific, the Niagara Peninsula is the only part that cares about this war. This pervasive myth, Canada burned down the White House. Didn't. The British did. Canadian forces were fencibles and militia. None of them served outside of Canada's borders. Any Canadian that was in the British forces there was there as a British professional soldier in a British regiment. So initially there's a couple thousand British troops here. I want to say another 5,000 are sent after Napoleon appears to be defeated. He's actually just taking the break. And basically what happens is the Americans go on an offensive. Now, I will admit these campaigns I don't know as well, but basically what happened is the British launched 2 offensives. The real goal was Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. was essentially the feint. And in all fairness to the Secretary of War, was it Wilkinson at that point? If it was Wilkinson, he basically called it. He said, they're going to attack. Baltimore is what we should defend. And in America's, to America's credit, they did defend it, and they even got a couple lyrics out of it. The British basically take the White House after the Battle of Bladensburg. And Bladensburg is basically a humiliating American defeat where the American militia is rapidly scattered by the British. But what's interesting about the battle is it remains the only battle in American history where a United States president directly on the field, pistol in hand, led troops into battle.
Really? Are you serious?
Yes, James Monroe was in the battle.
I did not. I did not know that. That's what an amazing fact. The president, commander in chief, was in the field, pistol in hand, leading troops.
He insisted on taking command himself, which is hilarious because James Madison, at like 5'1" and about 95 pounds, is easily and absolutely unelectable by today's standards. A complete nerd. The nerdiest, scrawniest president in U.S. history, and he is the one that leads troops into battle. It's hilarious. Wow. And he performs miserably. He fires both of his 2 flintlocks far out of range for those pistols to hit the British. And after the lying dissipates, he orders a retreat. The White House is burned. Famously, his wife, Dolly, who, unlike James, was absolute life of the party kind of lady, she would be electable today, saves President Washington's portrait. You know, that's America, finding a victory in one heck of a defeat and calling it a victory anyway. It saves the portrait. The White House is, first what happens is they have a little soiree. It's actually quite cute. When the British arrived, they discovered that the president's dinner was still laid out for him. So the officers decided to have dinner in the White House, toast King George III and the Prince Regent, and then afterwards, when the dinner was settled, they torched the place. And in all fairness, it wasn't called the White House at this time. It was called the Capitol. It was called the President's Mansion. It was actually pink. So he rebuilt it white. So, you know, that must be nice. But it was actually a pinkish hue. Interestingly, the George Washington Monument was also there, still unfinished. Anyway, it's burned. At this point, a freak hurricane strikes the coast and compels the British to after the damage done, the British decide to leave Washington earlier than planned. But either way, it was only a raid. It was never meant to occupy the capital. It was just a raid, and it was just an attempt to keep American forces occupied. But surprisingly, Wilkinson, who was not particularly brilliant as a commander of U.S. forces, made the right call by reinforcing Baltimore, and Baltimore did in fact hold, famously by Lewis Armistead's uncle, and Fort McHenry didn't fall, and you know that story. At this point, the British also attacked Sackett Harbor, which was their other main goal. The attack on Sackett Harbor, led by George Prevost, is led by ships that are not even finished their construction yet. It is premature. It is poorly organized. Prevost will pay for it dearly. He was the Governor General of Lower Canada, by extension Upper Canada. Prevost will pay for it dearly. It ruins his career. If Sackett Harbor had been taken, it's possible that a section of the Upper American Peninsula might have been demanded in the Treaty of Ghent. But since Sackett Harbor held, that was abandoned. And that was the 1814 offensive. But what it really demonstrated was the Americans were on the defensive. The Americans made one last thrust in 1814, which is the famous General Brown invasion with his lieutenants Eliza Ripley and the far more famous Brigadier General Winfield Scott. The invasion was a failure, ending with the sortie at Fort Erie and the retreat of the Americans. But they did demonstrate at the Battle of Chippewa and the Battle of Lundy's Lane that they were at least equal of the British. Congratulations, guys. Not very useful to winning a war, but hey, you know, points to you. You did it. Then there's a lull in the action. You have the negotiations over the treaty. The British launched their invasion of Louisiana, and you know where that story ends.
Yeah. Well, so we whooped you British twice.
I think if that was your takeaway from this conversation, then I can only sit in admiration of your mind palace.
No, I did think a while ago when you said about Fort McHenry. I love Vargas, Colonel Fremantle, did not forgive my uncle or myself.
Yeah. Oh, I just love the irony of it. Which it is funny that his uncle rather, defends the first U.S. Star-Spangled Banner, and there's Armistead fighting against it. It's but there's so much irony in the Civil War that doesn't even rank in like the B tier. But it is fun.
I love when he says, I must appreciate the irony of it all. I told you that, Kemper.
Oh, it's a nice speech.
That's what I'm saying. Because Jordan died not too long after that.
Yes, Richard Jordan actually passed away before the film went to theatrical release, which is why in the credits the film's dedicated to Richard Jordan. Jordan fortunately was able to see a rough cut of the film. Sorry?
Maxwell was actually afraid he was going to die before they finished it.
Oh yeah, no, they're in the sequence where he's been shot. Yeah, when he's at the cannon, he's been shot. He actually was having spasmodic pain.
Right, and Maxwell was going to stop filming at first.
Yeah, and he basically shouted at him, "No, for God's sake, you're filming the real thing."
They said they said when Chamberlain's brother Tom said, "Sir, can you hear me?" That really wasn't a line. It was like because Armistead Jordan would have these headaches so bad he couldn't hear. Yeah, just making sure coherent. So, and then I was like, it puts a whole new perspective on it when you see them film a dying man who's actually dying.
Oh, it's extraordinary, and I mean, really, he didn't get the attention because Gettysburg. I mean, we love the film Gettysburg. It's a great movie in its own right. It's not an Oscar film, but Richard Jordan gave an Oscar performance. He should have been nominated for Best
Supporting. On that. Yeah, yeah.
Now he's still against Schindler's List, so he's not going to win. But he was snubbed for a nomination. And I'll go further and say Jeff Daniels deserved a nomination for Best Lead. Again, he wasn't going to win it. Liam Neeson was going to win it because Schindler's List is one of the best ones ever made. But they deserved a nod, and it sucks they didn't get it because they really deserved it.
Yeah, he did too. I mean, because I agree with you on that. I didn't know Chamberlain. I didn't know Jordan came up for that nomination, but you're right. He did give an amazing performance. That was
extraordinary. Best performance of his life. And Richard Jordan was a lovely actor, but best performance of his career, extraordinary. And I think he knew it. And I think that's in his performances. Beautiful. Yeah, I think really, what a perfect choice for Lou Armistead.
Yeah, well, I think that probably is the best performance that I want to think about his movies. Just because every moment was, what's the word? I don't want to say dramatic, but
it was filled with the sense of pathos because the actor knows he's dying.
Okay,
he's playing a man whose soul is being rended, and in the context of the novel it's based on, there is a sense that Armistead knows his time is coming because his meeting with Hancock is coming. Now that's of course fictionalized, but they're making the film about a novel, not the actual battle. In that context, having a man knowing he's dying playing that role is a rather extraordinary thing. And Jordan channeled that pathos into that, and it shows. It's beautiful. It's truly beautiful.
I don't know why. My favorite part of that whole movie, and for this is such an obscure moment, is when Kemper's riding back, and he says, "You got to come up low. You got to come up and help
us." God name, they're flanking us. They're flanking us, come right at us. That would have been Stannard's. Was that Stannard's brigade? Doing that flanking? Yes, I think so, because the 8th Ohio was on the other side, and they flanked Brockenbrough, and then Joe Davis, as I recall.
Yes, I think you're right. I don't know why, but that one. I mean, there was no that part when he goes head for the trees, head for the center. For some reason, that's just my favorite part. I don't know why.
Probably because it's shot so well. It's really wonderfully shot. It's a really good sequence.
Back, he's like, "What are you doing?"
Yeah. No, it's very wonderfully shot. The cinematography is good. The lighting is perfect. It's a great shot. I hate to say it, but it is getting very late.
Well, I enjoyed the conversation.
Absolutely. Right here, I hope I gave you some good stuff for your project.
Something stuff to look up now too. I mean, you're giving me something to read now. Several of these battles I never heard of. Now I want to learn about them.
Absolutely. There's a lot of 1812 is a messy, interesting conflict. The Civil War is my passion, but when I was a youth, my interest in history was sparked in the 6th grade by the War of 1812. So and it comes up every now and then, and I've studied it a bit more when I have the chance every now and then. It's just a strange, futile little conflict. But when I was 12 years old, it meant the world to me.
Well, I bet, yeah, especially because Canadians real big up there. But yeah. So it's like I said, use the slate for you. I'm gonna keep things going on, and we'll talk soon.
Absolutely. Have a good one.
And you too.
See you later.